All right. Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure, after a fantastic day of really heated and very interesting debate, to introduce our final session, No Platform is Hate Speech, Free Speech. And while no platforming in safe space has been criticised by commentators and has often been in the media of late, it is important to remember this, that UK law maintains stringent restrictions on incitement to racial and religious hatred, that our hate speech laws are seen by many as an untouchable area. So I think what we want to get to grips with in this session is, can we really blame students for being censorious, or are they simply copying the trends of wider society? And with me today, I've got a really excellent panel, and just before he was billed, Dan Hodges, who's unfortunately had a family emergency and so can't make it today. We're very sorry, and he's very sorry about that. Nevertheless, speaking first will be Miriam Namazi, a human rights activist, and speaking first is Brendan, the editor of Spiked, and he also writes for many other publications. Next is Miriam Namazi, who's a human rights activist and recently subject of campus censorship herself. And then finally we have Douglas Murray, who's associate editor at The Spectator and also an author of many books. So each of the panelists will have 5 minutes max, then I will cut them off and we will go out to questions from the audience. So without further ado, Brendan.
Thank you. I completely reject the entire category of hate speech. And I'm always really surprised that so many people treat the category of hate speech seriously. You hear people having discussions like, is this hate speech, is that hate speech? And I'm always thinking, what are you doing? Why are you treating hate speech as some kind of measurable scientific category? To my mind, the category of hate speech is as ridiculous and as abominable, in fact, as the idea of thought crime. And my mission in life, or at least this afternoon, is to create a situation where people bristle and balk as much at the phrase hate speech as they do at the phrase thought crime. There are 2 reasons I reject the category of hate speech. The first is that this is an ideological invention. It is explicitly designed to repress the expression of certain ideas, and it does that to great effect. It is an ideological tool disguised as a moral good. And the second reason I reject the category of hate speech is because it encroaches into the realm of free communication in an extraordinary way, in a way that no other law or censor in modern times has done. Because it polices not only ideas, but also emotions, feelings. It is the definition of government overreach. It has all the ingredients of tyranny. So on the first point, the ideology of the category of hate speech, you can really see its ideological component if you look at the history of the modern idea of hate speech. Because after the Second World War, the keenest proponents for controls on hate speech were the Soviet Union. And you had all these international gatherings in the 1940s and 50s where people were drawing up international treaties and so on. And the Soviets were always pushing for the criminalization of hate speech, particularly fascistic and racist speech. They wanted international treaties to demonize and potentially criminalize hatred and incitement to hatred. And amazingly, the West actually resisted their demands. Eleanor Roosevelt was leading the Western camp for a period of time while these international treaties were being drawn up. And she said it would be extremely dangerous to outlaw hate speech because any criticisms of public or religious authorities might all too easily be described as incitement to hatred. Now, amazingly, the Soviets won, and in 1965, the UN Convention outlawed the following: ideas based on racial superiority. The key word there is ideas. From the outset, hate speech laws were about repressing ideas, obnoxious ideas, but nonetheless ideas. It is an ideological tool for the repression of ideas. And even worse than being an ideological tool, it's an extremely elastic one. It's extraordinary how unwieldy and arbitrary hate speech laws are and how much they have spread. So they've spread from criminalizing racial speech to criminalizing religious hatred. In Scandinavia, there are discussions to outlaw misogynistic speech. On campuses, they want to outlaw, or they no platform, transphobic speech. So hate speech restrictions spread and spread and spread. There's an unstoppable momentum because once you accept the originally Soviet idea that some forms of speech are so hateful they must be repressed, then there is no end to what you might potentially censor. Just to see how terrifying this is, in Sweden, a Christian pastor was given a 1-month suspended prison sentence for describing homosexuality as a tumor on society. Now, we might all think that's repulsive, but he believes that with every fiber of his being. He was imprisoned for expressing his beliefs. Brigitte Bardot has been fined 30,000 euros for describing the Islamic ritual slaughter of meat as barbaric. She believes that, really believes that. On campuses, you're not allowed to say that a person with a penis is a man. If you say that on campuses, they will accuse you of hate speech. This is the world we live in, folks. If you say a man is a man, you are accused of committing a hate speech crime. So the unstoppable logic is extraordinary. And students, I think, the students who try and clamp down on hate speech always present themselves as radicals, but actually they are the foot soldiers of a top-down, tyrannical attempt to repress the expression of ideas that started with the Soviet Union and was in the 60s and 70s embraced by Western powers. And then final point, the second point is the level of intervention the hate speech laws grant the authorities, which is that, yes, they suppress ideas, but they also police emotions. Hatred is an emotion. Might not be a big and clever emotion, but it is an emotion. And to invite the authorities or student unions or any other form of officialdom to police emotions is the definition of tyranny. We have to get serious about freedom of speech. It is unacceptable to repress the expression of ideas. It is unacceptable to repress the expression of hatred. And it is unacceptable to repress the expression of racism. The question posed here is hate speech free speech? I think we should say hate speech is a nonsense. There is only speech, and all speech should be free.
Okay, thanks, Maryam.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think freedom of speech in British universities is under heavier assault than ever before, in large part due to the proclaimed desire by the National Union of Students to maintain student safety by turning university campuses into safe spaces where students are apparently shielded from anything they might find offensive or hateful. With the increasing number of people being no-platformed at universities, however, it's becoming very clear that offense and hate are highly contested, which is why even when you look at legal codes in various countries, they vary quite profoundly. All too often, limits on speech are set by those with the loudest voices or those with the most political influence, like religious bodies or student unions or the state. And once limits are set, it's a slippery slope with no end in sight. In the name of tolerance of all, we end up with intolerance of all. So I know, of course, that hateful speech exists. My 10-year-old son asked me recently if his Muslim grandparents will have to leave America if Trump becomes president. They've been living there for the past 35 years and working there. As an apostate from Islam and a migrant, I know that hateful speech, whether from Islamists who call for my death or far-right groups like Pegida who want to deport all migrants, can be dehumanizing and intimidating. But banning speech deemed hateful doesn't stop discrimination, and of course anyone can be accused of it, even human rights activist Peter Tatchell. Also, it's those with power that determine what constitutes hate. Not, I might add, to stop discrimination, but very often to regulate socially unacceptable speech and stifle what's considered deviance or dissent. Per the National Union of Students, for example, Islamic societies can invite speakers who promote the death penalty for apostates, stoning for adultery, Yet my progressive counter-narrative is considered hate speech. Also, despite a context where apostates from Islam who are minorities within a minority are threatened with death for what is deemed blasphemy or apostasy, criticism of Islam is seen to be the same as violence against believers, even though there's clearly a huge distinction between words and deeds. Moreover, even if we agree that certain speech is hateful, which of course we don't, is banning it really the best way to challenge it? If that were the case, there would have been no need for social movements against racial apartheid, for civil rights, for Palestinian rights, for women's or gay or refugee rights, if you could solely defend people who are the target of hate speech by merely banning it. Banning speech is in fact very dangerous because it lulls us into a false sense of security and prevents us from doing the more important work of addressing and challenging hate head-on. It's a false assumption that one can combat hate with censorship. Also, when one considers that it's those in power who can most censor and also most normalize discrimination and hate, the absurdity of banning hate speech becomes all the more apparent. By their very nature, universities in particular should be places where orthodoxies are challenged and opinions questioned. Why would one go to university at all if you feel that you have to be protected from views you dislike or that offend you? Fundamentally, I think the NUS's concern for student safety and sensibilities gives progressive cover to what has fundamentally become a corporate approach to risk management in light of tuition fees. And also, I think, unfortunately, multiculturalism, not as a wonderful, brilliant, lived experience, but as a social policy, has erroneously conflated criticism of ideas, criticism of the religious far right, like Islamism, with an attack on people, Muslims, minorities. Clearly, free expression is vital for any university and for our societies at large. And it's not free unless it's free for everyone, including those whose views are deemed distasteful, deviant, and even hateful, as long as there is no incitement to violence. What we need is not more restrictions on free speech, but the opposite. What we need is a change in NUS policies that stifle expression and dissent on campus. As Salman Rushdie says, limiting free expression isn't just censorship, it's an assault on human nature. Human beings, he says, shape their future by arguing and challenging and saying the unsayable, not by bowing their knees, whether to gods or to men. Thank you.
Thank you, Maryam. And Douglas.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Spiked. It's a pleasure of a kind to be back at Conway Hall, which I've always sort of associated as being a venue of lost causes. So it's appropriate to be talking about free speech here, because it's a lost cause in the UK. A year ago, after the two gunmen went into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and killed 10 journalists and 2 policemen, I happened to be in a television studio and bumped into somebody from one of the tabloid newspapers, The Sun, and we were talking about what reactions people had to this. And he was about the only person who had a sensible reaction really to that. He said, well, we don't really care about free speech in Britain. And, you know, that's why we're in this situation. I said, really? I mean, you sure? He said, well, you know, just before this happened, the main thing that was happening was that there was a big debate about imprisoning one of their columnists, Katie Hopkins, for saying something about Scottish people. She said sweaty jocks. On the basis of that, prison, you know, sack, defenestration, the usual habits of modern Britain. It's just got worse, and it's going to get worse for a long time to come. Every week brings a new hilarity. If it's not feminists campaigning against Germaine Greer, It's people who say they're gay campaigning against Peter Tatchell. I mean, these are the people who've reaped the rewards of these leaders turning on them, and their movements are disappearing up their own fundaments, not before time. And you see, the problem is that everyone gets a piece of this in the end. Everyone wants a piece of it. Hate speech is the new shut up. Instead of I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to my death your right to say it, it's I disagree with what you say, so shut up. And everyone will want a piece of that because it's very useful for any political movement, and that's what a lot of this is. It basically falls into two groups of people. The people for whom it's a political movement. I can give you so many stories, as I'm sure all of you. I know an LGBT student at a British university who, because he said that the NUS shouldn't be using its time to campaign against various things of a conservative government, was described as a fake gay. He was pretending to be gay in order to advance a conservative agenda. You've really got to put in the hours, by the way, if you're going to do that. So some of them it's that. They just want their own political movement furthered. And some of them, it's what the late philosopher Ken Minogue used to describe as St. George in retirement syndrome. After slaying the dragon, St. George staggers around the landscape looking for ever smaller beasts to slay. This is what these people are. They find meaning in their lives, I think erroneously, from social justice movements, and they can't bear it. The dragons are all dead, but they've got to find new ones, and that's why Peter Tatchell and Germaine Greer become the biggest threats to our lives. The problem with all of this is that it changes the nature of education. Even when I was at school and at university, education was broadly believed to be a good thing because it was about the pursuit of truth. Truth is not a defense against these people. It's purely feelings and hurt and the potential for hate. You never hear people saying, but what I have to say about this might be true, and it might do you good to hear it. This is not a defense. I ended up recently speaking to the Cambridge University Political Society and saying to them after a spate of no platformings, you know, you can't on this campus now talk about anything to do with birth, or any of the steps that might lead up to birth, any of the preludes, as it were. You can't talk about gender. You can't talk about anything meaningful in life, including politics, religion, and you can't really talk much about death. So what's there left? And if you're not going to do the thinking on this, who is? Do you want the students at Hull to be leading the charge? Do you want it to be the students at another university or in another country? Or do you think it's possible at some stage that you might allow your fragile minds to take in some of these ideas yourselves? Look, there are very specific problems. The problem of ISOCs, which Maryam pointed out, is the one that's come up behind everybody. They don't realize these are highly politicized movements that are advancing an agenda, and they produce 5 people, all of whom think the same thing, and they pretend that's the mainstream of debate. Obviously, you have to counter that. In the meantime, very quickly, the point is that in a more and more pluralistic society, we seem to have decided that the only way to keep harmony is to shut everything down. And I think that's exactly the opposite. In a very pluralistic society, you're going to have to hear more and more voices, and you better get used to it. And in the meantime, when it comes to university campuses, there will simply be a very clear divide. There will be some universities where the kids are clever enough to realize that they should hear other ideas, and there will be some where they don't. And people just won't bother going to the ones that don't. I don't accept invitations to go to places where I think there's going to be some bother, because it's not that great a thrill. It's not that great a privilege to be asked to go out on a dank night in Kent to speak to some university you've never heard of who might no platform you anyway. You know? I could stay at home with a cat. So there will be some students who get this, and I just hope there are more of them, but it'll be a long time until they're a majority.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Now, just before we go out to the audience for questions, which is what I really want to spend most of the time doing, I think we're going to have to fight quite hard to pick out some disagreement in this panel. So Brendan, let me ask you, I think the other two speakers have talked about this being a problem mainly with students, and I just want to know whether you think this is an emergence of, a sudden emergence of soft-hearted students, or is the problem bigger than that?
I think it's bigger than that. There's definitely something wrong with students. They've lost the plot, they've become soft, they're, you know, pathetic and weak, and not all of them, but the guys who run it. But I think they are an expression of a broader problem in society, which is a collapse of belief in freedom of speech and Enlightenment values and the robust individual and the value of moral autonomy, all those things which have been withering across society for 30, 40 or 50 years. It is not remotely surprising that you would end up with a generation of what we used to call puffs, but you're probably not allowed to say that anymore. You know, wimps. Are you allowed to say wimps? I don't know. So, you know, a new generation which is pretty pathetic. I think they are the end result of various different things. Parenting styles, anti-bullying initiatives at schools, the idea that your self-esteem is the most sacred thing in the world, and if anyone offends it, you have the right to shut them down or shout in their face. If you cultivate a culture in which autonomy is undermined and how you feel about your self-worth is sacralized above everything else, you are going to give rise to this kind of crap on campus. So I think we should definitely hold them responsible because they are still making a conscious decision to pass these policies and to no platform people like Maryam and others. But we also need to contextualize it within the decay of Western society.
Okay, great. Maryam talked about having a problem with incitement to violence there, you mentioned that, and would you call yourself a free speech absolutist, or do you have a line?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, when you do have a line, it's going to create problems. That's just how it is. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I don't like a lot of things Pegida says. I don't like a lot of things the Islamists say. But if I want free speech for myself, and for those who dissent from them, then I also have to defend their right to speak. I mean, in a sense, when you defend free speech, you do have to defend a lot of really horrible people. And I think that's the reality of it. You know, I do think there's a line where your speech is deemed hateful or offensive versus you're actually inciting violence. And I would think, you know, a lot of Islamists are inciting violence, though it seemed to be the cuddly right to religion because of the world we live in now. But I do think there's a line, and the line is if you're actually inciting violence. But if you're speaking, I think we should let people speak. I have confidence in my position. I don't need you to censor anyone for me, because if I disagree with their speech, if I think their speech is hateful, I will challenge that speech with better speech. And I think, you know, if we're going to move forward, we have to hear speech that we don't like, that we find uncomfortable. That doesn't mean you're not free to challenge it. Of course you are, you know. And I think it's better for all of us if we can hear speech that's uncomfortable, but also be allowed to challenge it.
Okay, great, thanks. And Douglas. In previous sessions, we heard people talking about student censorship being enacted by a small but vocal minority, and I know you said that there's this idea that nobody cares about free speech anymore. Do you think this is the case with all students, or do you think that, do you agree with this idea that it is a small but vocal minority?
It's a small minority maybe, but they have a lot of bang for their buck. Because, you know, I have a lot of sympathy with most students. You're starting off in your career, you live in an age when a single slip of the thumb in a tweet could lead to a Twitter storm, could lead to online attack, could lead to you basically losing your place at university or becoming the subject of an international firestorm on the media. You know, that's different from 20 years ago when if you said something stupid as a student, you know, your friend might tell you what a git you were. But the world wasn't going to turn on you. I mean, students are trying to find their way through a very, very difficult period in information technology. And in that situation, you know, nobody wants even a totally erroneous accusation of, you know, racism, transphobia, homophobia, or anything else. They don't want it out there because, you know, after they leave, they're going to try to find a job to pay off their student debt, and they don't want somebody who Googles them to be, you know, my God, this is some terrible person who believes that there are men and women and that they're different things. You know, and you know, and I don't know, this is some terrible racist, Islamophobe, homophobe, etc., etc. You know, this guy's got a clean record. You know, who wants to bother? Who wants to bother looking into it? So that's the problem, is that the small minority carry the most powerful stick of our time. And that's why they win. But also, they're just willing to lie. I mean, there's that, you know, we should throw into the mix. I mean, they are just willing to lie. And a lot of other people believe in truth still, in sort of habit.
Okay. Right. So, let's see hands up, and we'll throw all of that into the mix. I'll bring the mic. Let's start at the back with the gentleman holding up the notebook there.
Thanks. Two quick questions. One to Douglas. I think you're underestimating the problem because we now see that at a national level, for example, only last week, a Labour MP, Chris Bryant, was calling for Tom Jones' song Delilah to be banned because of its sexist content. We see Labour and Scottish nationalist MPs calling for Donald Trump to be banned from the country. Tony Blair is now fronting a pan-European law, a campaign for a pan-European law in the name of tolerance to suppress freedom of speech in a whole range of areas. And the second point I'd like to make is in relation to Miriam, where you say you would draw the line by preventing people, or you would want to see people prevented from inciting violence. Will you either believe in individual freedom of autonomy and responsibility, or you don't? So simply because some idiot tells me to go and kill the infidel, or to kill all Muslims, I'm not going to do that, and if I choose to do that, then I should rightly be held responsible. So I don't understand why this kind of arbitrary distinction is being made by you.
Thanks. Hands up. Let's go to far back there, right at the back.
Thanks. I think, for me anyway, Douglas made a really, really important point which might get lost, you know, because of the delivery, which is you connected the question of free speech to the question of truth. And I think that's a really important relationship to keep together. And it does strike me, just a question for the panel, maybe we get the debate the wrong way around. I mean, it strikes me that in relation to moral, political issues today, people's conception of truth has become highly privatized, that they see it as a personal and identity thing. And maybe we need to attack the question of free speech in relation to establishing what we mean by truth as a public thing that we struggle towards. And that's why we need free speech. So I'm just wondering whether that might be an alternative way of arguing it. Thank you.
Let's bring it down here to this gentleman with the glasses right there next to you.
I think there's, I kind of would like to make it a little more specific and mention the fact that I think over the years, a lot of the barriers to free speech have actually been rowed back in this country. I'm old enough to remember the end, effectively, of censorship of books, the end of censorship of theatre. We've got rid of Section 28. We now have the anti-religious bit of the of discrimination that Labour implemented has never actually been brought into law. Has never actually been implemented. We have got glorification of terrorism, which, in theory, would outlaw praising the Gun or praising the Boston Tea Party or the ANC, but I think that's been rarely used. And I'd like to hear a little more, out of my own ignorance really, about what specific hate law is being objected to by the panel, which I think I would sympathise with. But I have one question, because what I think has happened is that we've moved away from a situation where basically censorship was the government stopping us hearing or seeing or reading things that were bad for us. You know, classic in the Lady Chatterley's trial, would you want your wife or servant to read this? To a situation where censorship is a kind of branch of consumer protection. And so it's different bodies from the state, by and large, who are up to it. And I just wonder a little bit if there are certain things that you can require of clubs, of other kinds of bodies, which you'd object to if it was required by the state. And I just have one example of that, which is a question to everybody. Do you think that football clubs have a right to exclude people who shout nigger at black players?
Okay. The lady just in front of you there, please.
Question and a point. What the first, my question is the concept of offence or offensiveness actually useful, or is that also trapped within the emotions, and is it just subjective? I know, Brendan, you do use the concept, and I find it not very helpful, because I don't think I've ever been offended by anything other than that kind of thrill you feel when you hear a particularly filthy joke, and I actually really enjoy that feeling. So I can't think of an instance where I've actually been offended by an opinion. So maybe I'm weird, but I don't know what it actually means, and I wonder whether it is a useful concept. Secondly, I watched the video, Maryam, of your debate at Goldsmiths, and what that made me think was, at a certain point, the people who want to defend free speech are going to have to man up and actually defend the space in which free speech occurs, in which case it was the room that you were in. And I could not believe that nobody hustled those guys out of the room or punched them in the face. It was disgusting to me that didn't happen. I would have quite happily performed that on your behalf. So how do, practically, students actually make real the practice of free speech? Because I think at a certain point it comes down to that as an exemplary behaviour of how you enact free speech.
Great, okay, we're going to come back. I'll go to this side next, but we're going to come back to the panel. I think I'll ask Douglas to come back and open up first.
May I start with a very important question of Delilah? I wasn't aware of that one, but I mean, every day there are dozens of these sort of things. It's just virtue signalling by politicians like Chris Bryant and others, you know. I mean, they're all going to be in a pickle with the Donald Trump thing if he actually becomes US president, aren't they? But there's nothing to lose, they think. There's only something to gain. I signal that I'm against bigotry. I signal that I'm against Tom Jones. There's nothing to lose, there's only something to gain. The gentleman at the back here, I'm glad you picked up on that. It's true that truth should be the defense, and it should be the basis on which one puts the pegs down to bed in and fight back. It's difficult, definitely, in an age where truth is thought by a lot of students still to be very relative. But there's a possibility there. That's the only way you can do it, and to say in the great tradition of English liberty that one of the purposes of free speech, indeed the most important one, is to get to the truth. The gentleman who said about the hate speech laws, yes, I mean, I think it's a very striking thing, by the way. They are used, the glorification laws and others, they're not used as much as some people think. The striking thing to look out for is the number of times when the police use effectively speech laws on people that have done a lot worse, because it's easier. It's easier to get them on the speech stuff than it is on cell activity that seems to be leading to something that could be. So, I mean, and part of that is simply a restfulness issue. It's easier for the police to sit looking at Twitter all day than it is, I mean, imagine, it's delightful to get the call saying, could you investigate the Sun columnist Katie Hopkins, or some poor guy on the south coast of England who said that he'll drown Tom Daley, who's about the hardest person in Britain to drown, by the way. But let's get that guy. It's easier than a real day's work. By the way, the last time I was speaking at this hall, I think, some years ago, was another reason I have bad memories of this place is that there are about 150 Islamists standing outside in the group from Anjan Chowdhury's group, which were banned after that evening, shouting kuffar, filthy kuffar, and fucking faggot at me. About 150. They got banned afterwards. I'm very proud of the fact that they were banned not because they were calling me a faggot or a kuffar, but because some numbers of them in the days afterwards were found to be trying to blow up the London Stock Exchange and target rabbis and other people in this country for assassination. But just finally on your offended point at the front, I'd like to pretend that I never feel offense, but most human beings do feel offense at some point. And let me give you a very quick, if I may, example of this, but I think it might be pertinent. some years ago, before I was writing voluminously myself, I remember reading Bron War's columns in a paperback version. And there was one point at which he said something, I mean, he was, fantastic, one of the greatest satirists this country's ever produced. I remember in one of the columns he said, homosexuals remind me of soufflés. They're delicious whilst they're there, but afterwards, poof, there's nothing left. Now, I remember at the time thinking, I found that hurtful. Definitely. I didn't want to ban him. I found it hurtful. But if you think back on that, what was the origin of the point he was making? One of the points was that gays don't have children, which is, broadly speaking, and biologically certainly true. But if you were to ban Bron War, as you almost certainly would today, you'd have to ban Shakespeare next. Because the last couplet of Sonnet 12, Shakespeare says, nothing against time's scythe can make defense, save breed to brave him when he takes thee hence. So if you lose Bron War, you've got to lose Shakespeare. And if you've lost Shakespeare, what have you got left? Some Derrida, post-structuralist, post-crap, and, the collected, sanitized column, which now everyone wants us all to write, which consists of a column that would effectively be written by committee and can be objected to by no one, i.e., a column nobody should want to read.
Going back to a question a gentleman asked over there about I think it was you, the distinction between hate speech and incitement to violence. I think there is a real distinction there, and you have to be able to prove real harm in a court of law. I think otherwise, I think there's so much hate speech going on. For me, I think lots of the ayahs of the Quran are hate speech. So are verses in the Bible or Torah or what have you. A lot of politicians, I think it'll be hard to find one mainstream politician that isn't perpetrating some sort of hate speech or offense, and I think what will happen is that eventually no one will be allowed to speak. And is that the best option that's available to us? I think we need to have the confidence that if we find speech offensive and hurtful, and you can be sure that I've heard a lot of speech that I find offensive and hurtful. Nonetheless, we need to be confident enough to be able to challenge that with more speech, with better speech, rather than coming down on the side of censorship. I think the reality is that when we're talking about speech or any right, it is the right of us, the people, vis-a-vis those in power. And when we advocate for restrictions, we're actually handing over permission to states and those with power and influence to silence us. Because the reality is that eventually we are the ones who will get silenced, as is being very clear. The no platform against fascists was something a vast majority applauded, and now you've got Peter Tatchell, facing it. So it just shows that it's a slippery slope which leads us to no one being allowed to say anything, and I think that is hugely dangerous. Also, with regards Goldsmiths, I think that day we did defend free speech, and no one was beaten up, though maybe some of us would have liked to beat some people up, but most likely than not, they wanted to beat me up. No one was beaten up, no one was, thrown out. Well, eventually the guard had to intervene. But I think that's a good example of how you can defend free speech, even when it seems quite a difficult situation to be in. I think for me, what's clear about Goldsmiths is that the Islamists are very intimidating, and they do scare a lot of people. I think they might have even scared the security guard, to be honest. And, and that's a reality. After Goldsmiths, I got letters from Muslims who said that they agreed with me, but they were too afraid to say anything. And I think that is a reality. So especially when you're dealing with Islamists who are so scary, who are so threatening. At the meeting, one of the Islamists pointed a gun at one of the audience who was speaking up. Another, he passed by and he made a boom sound, like he's going to explode the place. So all of these threats, as well as trying to shut my PowerPoint, walking back and forth past me, could be seen to be intimidating, and I think we have to take that into consideration as well. It's not always that easy when you're in that situation to stand up for free speech. And I think you could see how many of the students were very cowed. Close to the end of my talk, a lot of people clapped for me, and I was actually quite surprised, because at the beginning I thought no one agreed with me, because of the climate that they had created. So I think, if we stand our ground, eventually we will win. It's hard work to do, and we have to understand how difficult it is for students to speak up very often as well. But I think, again, defending it, we don't need to come to blows. We just need to say, we're going to speak no matter what. And I think I did that by just refusing to let the meeting be cancelled, and that's the sort of things we need to do. Just one last thing I want to say is on the issue of identity. What's happened is that students very often, and society at large, we're no longer showing solidarity with ideals, but with identities. And that's why we're getting it so very wrong. The lesbians, the LGBTQ plus society, or the feminist society of Goldsmiths sided with the Islamic society against me, because they only see the Muslim identity and they don't see the dissent. And I think we need to move away again from identity politics and real social justice, which means fighting for ideals, for truth, for universal rights and freedoms, irrespective of the identities of those involved.
Yeah, in relation to what students can do to challenge censorship, it's always just worth remembering that freedom of speech is not something that can be given to you. Freedom of speech is something that you have, and you do, and you exercise. If you wait around for someone to say, over here you're allowed to say such and such, then you'll be waiting forever. So I think they just need to exercise their freedom of speech and bear the consequences that come along with that. If you're at a university which has banned Robin Thicke's song Blurred Lines, it is incumbent upon you to get a sound system and play Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines on a loop all day long. My favourite form of student censorship is some campuses, some student unions have banned the making of sexual noises in the student bar. When I was at university, if they banned the making of sexual noises, I can guarantee you everyone would be making sexual noises. It's a principled matter. You must make a sexual noise in the name of freedom of speech. So you challenge it by doing what they forbid you from doing, and then if you get in trouble, you build a campaign around that, you get a media interest, you alert people to the fact that you are potentially being thrown off campus for having made a sexual noise, and that's what you do, I think. You don't wait for them to change. In relation to what hate speech laws exist or have been used, there are numerous examples. A student, 2 or 3 years ago, a student was imprisoned for 56 days for saying something racist on Twitter. This is the country we live in. People are imprisoned for 56 days for saying something. A member of a racist party was given an 8-month suspended prison sentence and community service for writing a blog post that contained the word wogs. This is the country we live in. People are fined for making jokes. After last year's truck disaster in Glasgow, when a truck killed some people around Christmas time, the police visited the homes of people who tweeted jokes about that incident. There are numerous examples of hate speech laws being used to arrest, fine, and imprison people, and the lack of outrage about it today is really, really surprising. I'm hoping that in the future, historians will look back and be amazed that people tolerated the existence of this kind of legislation. But having said that, I do think censorship is also being outsourced by the state to rising numbers of private groups, student unions, other kind of non-state bodies, and that is very worrying, and particularly the way in which student unions are kind of taking the baton from the state and are enforcing their own form of censorship of anything they don't like. Final thing, in relation to free speech as a means of discovering or trying to discover the truth. I think that's very important, and it's a point that John Stuart Mill makes, which is the only way you can be sure that what you're saying is potentially true is by testing it in public debate, subjecting it to ridicule and criticism and discussion and everything else. Otherwise, it's just dogma. If you just believe it because you know it's true, you're just a dogmatist, and I think that's the case with lots of these NUS officials who ban things. Censorship is the midwife of stupidity. It makes you stupid. If you live inside a safe space and no kind of controversial idea or idea that you hate is allowed to enter that safe space, then you are making yourself into an idiot, and you are making yourself dogmatic. The safe space is a bigger trap for the people inside it than it is for the people outside. In the words of Cardinal John Henry Newman, the human intellect does from opposition grow. It's only through exposing yourself to opposition and criticism and abuse and offensiveness and outrage and insults that your own intellect can grow. So the thing that worries me most about students is that they are making themselves dumb. Yeah. That's the real consequence of censorship.
Okay. I'm going to see your hands. That side last time. I'm going to come to this side now, so we can bring the mic over here. And please be very short. I want to get as many in as possible. Let's start at the back there. The lady there, right next to you. Stand up and be as short as you can.
I have 2 quick points to make that hasn't really been picked up. When student union officers talk about hate speech, what they really mean is right-wing speech. So they're trying to censor out political opinions that they don't like. And I'm just wondering, is this like a reflection of how standards in British education are falling because they're incapable of actually presenting reasoned arguments, logic and facts and evidence to disagree with opinions that they don't like? The culture within universities is that if you don't agree with someone, you shut them down. Or in my case, you're told that you're a bigot, you're a racist, you're a sexist. In other words, they're attacking the individual as opposed to attacking your own arguments.
Thank you. Straight in front. Just straight in front there. Yeah.
I don't think we really realise how deeply entrenched in our establishment that hate speech actually is. As we speak now, the European Union are formulating policies to make questioning and challenging feminism a hate speech, a hate crime. Not many people actually realise that. So we have feminists in every university, but we're not allowed to critique them at all. In 2 or 3 years' time, the EU is actually formulating policies to make that. And this is probably why I've been banned at least 10 times by universities speaking on, if men have all the power, how come feminism makes all the rules? The last time I was actually banned was from Manchester University's Free Speech Society on that very issue. But finally, let me actually tell you, this is the feather in my cap. The last time I was banned, no platformed, twice last year, was by Comey Hall Ethical Society. Thank you.
Right. Let's rather hear questions than right. Way over here, and you there. Yep, you.
Hi, so this has all been quite vitriolic, which is great fun, but also quite divisive. What I'm wondering is, the focus of this has been on kind of attaining a high truth or objectivity, and one of the means of doing that is debate. It seems to me that the group which struggles with this is those who aren't able to listen, and those who have a kind of struggle within themselves. And I guess what I'm wondering is debate and is rationality the only means to tolerance, or are there perhaps other ways? And for those who don't have the inner resilience to confront challenges they find, how would the panel suggest that they respond to the problems in the world?
Brilliant, thank you. And directly in front of you, the lady with the glasses. Yeah, thanks.
Hi. This whole idea of incitement to hatred I find ridiculous because, first of all, it presupposes that hatred and emotion is some sort of crime or ought to be one. I don't think the government have any business policing our emotions, just like they have, well, our hatred, just like they have no business compelling our love for their politicians or policies. Secondly, it presupposes that other people somehow determine an individual's emotional response. And as such, it's an attack on agency, which is really a very important pillar of the liberal concept of individual responsibility, the flip side of which are individual rights. So Brendan, I think you're absolutely right when you say that this whole thing is it's symbolic of the decay of Western society. And finally, one little other point.
Very quickly.
It's okay, it's possible to measure physical injury, but measuring offense, how do you do that? Anyone can say they're offended. It's kind of an abstract idea. And there's no evidence needed. Just the claim, I'm offended, is enough to shut down the offending speaker, which seems absolutely ridiculous.
Great, thank you. So show of hands, come down here. Take two more very quick, please.
So I completely agree. I don't advocate for the incitement of violence, but I still really want to know the answer to the toughest question, I think, is when do you know when hate speech becomes an incitement of violence?
Thank you.
Okay,
Brilliant.
it's a tough one.
Keep it short like that. And who was in the front here? Show me your hand. No? Right, we'll keep it to that. Brendan, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I think on incitement to violence, well, it's very difficult to know when hate speech becomes incitement to violence. That's the problem with having these clear boundaries. And I don't think I'm in favour of censoring incitement to violence, because often what it means in the context of where it's happened is, for example, an Islamist praising what happened on 9/11. I think people should have the freedom to praise what happened on 9/11. Or, people's expressing support for Hamas or ISIS or some other repugnant group. I think people should have the right to express support for those groups. And I think it's Peter Tatchell, I'm a fan of Peter Tatchell. I wrote a piece for The Spectator this week defending his right to freedom of speech. But the last time I had a debate with Peter Tatchell about freedom of speech, he was arguing that Jamaican dancehall singers who sing about killing homosexuals should be banned on the basis that they incite violence. And my argument was they don't incite violence. They sing about, they fantasize about killing homosexuals. That's really different. And also, if you hear a song in a disco and the lyrics go into your mind and you think, oh, now I'm going to go out and kill a homosexual, that's your fault. That's not their fault. So Peter Tatchell, bless him, has been on the wrong side of the debate about freedom of speech a few times, and then he wrote a piece in The Guardian calling me a smug shite for defending freedom of speech for homophobic singers. So I think the lines are difficult to draw, which is why I think we should err on the side of not having any. And it really is important that we take freedom of speech responsibility seriously, because there are two beneficiaries when it comes to freedom of speech. The person who has something to say, whether it's interesting, stupid, racist, clever, whatever, those people must have the right to say what they want to say. But more importantly is the right of the audience to hear them and to judge for yourselves if they are talking rubbish or saying something interesting. If you allow the state or the student unions or someone else to make that decision on your behalf, you are infantilizing yourself. Censorship is bad for people who are being censored, but it's even worse for everyone else, because our moral, intellectual muscles become weak. And it's incumbent upon us to fight for freedom of speech for everyone so that we can make up our own minds about what's true, what's false, what's good, and what's bad.
Very quickly, the person said, what do we do against them? There is a possibility, which is to respond to their insincere claims with equally insincere claims. My Catholic conservative colleague at The Spectator, Miriam Namazi, wrote a very good piece recently about doing a debate on abortion. She has the conventional views of the Catholic Church on abortion, and some women came on the stage and sat there and said they wouldn't leave because they were being violated and their safe space was being, etc., etc. And so Melanie McDonough went over to them and said, excuse me, but could you leave because you're making me feel unsafe? And as she said, there we were, a standoff between two equally insincere groups. So that's one possibility. Free speech incitement, I pretty much agree with what Brandon said, with one exception, which is that the incitement thing is whether or not really there's any plausible likelihood of you carrying out or having the capacity to carry out anything on the back of it. So if the guy who says he wants to drown Tom Daley is nearby Tom Daley in a swimming pool, and Tom Daley's trying to come up, and the guy is like there with his hand, then the police should take some interest. Equally, the problem with the Islamists, as Maryam and everyone else knows, is that the threat is the thing of, well, you know, I may not chop your head off, but I can't promise that one of my, you know, contacts or somebody else some way behind me, you know, it's a kind of classic thug trick. You know, my mate's really angry, I'm just holding him back. That's very, very effective. What should you do? So the guy, one answer is far too many people go to university now. The people at universities who should not be there. They don't have the mental faculty to cope with it. And they should go into a useful profession and train for it, and everyone would be better off, and they'd have less debt, and we'd have more plumbers and everything else. And as for the final thing, look, it's a pressure cooker issue. Just recently, at the end of last year, Angela Merkel sat down at a UN thing beside Mark Zuckerberg, and she had a mic still on, and Angela Merkel was overheard saying to Mark Zuckerberg, what can you do to stop people writing anti-immigration things on Facebook? And he said, quote, we're working on it. Now, my suggestion is this, is that in the years ahead, we are going to have one hell of a set of problems in Europe. And it is because a lot of things are happening at the same time as those in power are trying to stop people saying things. This is a pressure cooker that they are building up. Because if you don't allow people to speak, then the only resort is to punch people. If you say to people, you can't mention anything about the change in your society, then the only thing they can do is to do violence somewhere down the road. It's a terrible thing we're setting up. It's a disaster. And people need to call that out now. You cannot put a lid on public opinion and think it won't blow out the side somewhere.
Just a couple of points. I disagree with using the concept of safe space if you oppose it to begin with. I mean, you know, during my talk at Goldsmiths, I talked about Bangladeshi bloggers being hacked to death by Islamists in Bangladesh. The Islamists were laughing when I said that, and they were shouting out safe space every time I criticized them. You know, obviously I felt slightly unsafe in that meeting, as did many others, but if I'm going to use the same argument, there's no point to that, and I think we need to stand by the fact that you cannot use safe space in order to silence criticism. I also want to defend students. I mean, I think that it is a bit unfair to blame students for the situation that we're faced with today. You know, this is decades of British government policy, whether it's the Labour government or the Conservative government, in perpetrating a sort of climate where, you know, a multicultural social policy, where identity politics reign supreme, where oftentimes communities are seen to be homogeneous, and where the government has outsourced a lot of, you know, the managing of migrants and the Muslim community to Sharia courts and to Islamic organizations and so on and so forth. So this whole identity politics that the NUS and students are perpetrating, it has been state policy for quite a while, whether we're looking at faith schools or anything of that other nature. The last point I just want to make is that there is clearly a distinction between speech and action, and I think it's not right to say that even incitement to violence is the same as incitement to hate. It's not. And I think Douglas made an excellent example. I think, and legally, there are legal frameworks for that. You have to show that there is direct and imminent harm. And I think that is where incitement to violence is a very different thing from hate speech. Hate speech is speech, and like any speech should be free. Incitement to violence is a very different thing.
Okay, great, thank you. We are running out of time, so I'm going to take 3 questions, and then we're going to come back to the panel for closing remarks. Please keep this very brief, or I will get the mic holder to cut you off. Lady right at the back there. There. very quick, please.
Yeah, just a quick point about, it's all been talked about in terms of offense, but there's also an element of snobbishness towards the masses when it comes to the idea of hate speech. The idea that football fans who sing Delilah go home and hit their wives, and not in a sexy way, or just generally, you know, or Pegida in Germany, especially, the idea that hatred is something that incites a new, third or fourth Reich that's going to come. So the idea of disdain for the masses, that is inherent within the idea of hate speech. I think maybe you could mention something about that.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the gentleman here in the aisle. Just there.
Thank you. The idea of what is offence and taking offence, I think, was very well illustrated by a television programme a couple of months ago. There was a series called It Was All Right in the 60s, 70s, 80s. They had a panel of sort of D-list celebs who were watching old, mildly racist or sexist sitcoms and outdoing each other to see how much offence they could take. I think one of them, after seeing some sort of mild bit of sexism on an old Terry and June thing, announced, "Oh my fucking God, how did they get away with that?"
Okay, thank you. And let's come right to the front, please. This lady down here.
Hello. Just a headline for Douglas, which has just come up on the phone. British police have promised not to tolerate any speech that could cause offence on social media regarding Syrian migrants after arresting a man for Facebook comments made about recent arrivals on his small Scottish island. So.
Okay, and let's see hands. Okay, this lady here in the aisle. Please be very quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Maryam, I know she said that she thinks you should challenge hate speech, or speech basically head on. But what do you think about no platforming? Have you no platform? I thought you have no platformed people.
Okay.
Have you yourself? And I just thought, given that you were no platformed yourself.
All right, fine, thanks. Okay, we're going to have closing remarks now. Sorry, we don't have as much time as we would like. Douglas, can we start off with you?
Yeah, sure. Very quickly, by the way, there's something I meant to say before as well. I listened to about the last 15 minutes of the last panel, which was a great demonstration of why you need more speech. The guy sitting in the chair I'm sitting in here was woefully uninformed about what he was talking about. He seemed to think that on the basis of some NUS jolly, he understood the Middle East peace process problems and had decided to attribute blame. Now, that guy, when he grows up, I hope he learns more. But in the meantime, one of the biggest problems we deal with on this is that whilst everyone's talking about their feelings, no one's talking about the facts. And I was recently speaking at a university about the Middle East, as it happened, and I said at one point, some guy stood up and said, something about the border of Gaza and so on. And I said, oh, well, join me in calling for the Egyptians to pull down that border. And I could just see that everyone sort of started getting out their phones. Border, Egypt, Gaza. These are people who think they can solve the Middle East peace process, but they couldn't point to Israel on a map. And that's a very significant part of the problem. They don't know any of the facts, but they've got all the feelings. Very quickly, very quickly, promise. The Syrian migrant story that the lady down there at the front just absolutely symptomatic of this, and a good example of how this blows. I repeat the warning on this. Next time something like what happened in November in Paris happens in a European city, and if it is the case that anybody involved happened to come through routes from Syria into Europe, European leaders have been found in the meantime to be stopping anybody saying that that is a potential problem. You have a powder keg. I'm not a fan of powder keg theories, but there is one right in front of us. Shut down people saying things, and then something happens, and it turns out that no European leader can speak to the people because the people know the European leaders are lying to them. This is a catastrophe, and we're setting it up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just a couple of quick points. One is on the issue of no platforming. I've never no platformed anyone. I think the far right in particular have the mistaken idea that if I'm pro-free speech, that means I'm not allowed to challenge or question them. Well, I'm sorry. They have the free speech to talk bigotry and hatred against migrants, against Muslims, as I have the free speech to challenge and criticize them. So I think that that's where some of the controversy around this has taken place, and I've been accused of no platforming. They simply don't understand the term. The other issue I want to say is that I think, one point on this matter is that when we say that speech is hateful, we are homogenizing groups of people that we say then are feeling that they're discriminated against or they're feeling hate against. But no society or community is homogeneous. You've got, Fatima Naout in Egypt being sentenced to 3 years in prison, also because she criticized Islamic animal slaughter. You've got Roya Nobacht in Iran, who's facing a 20-year-old prison sentence because she has said the Iranian regime is too Islamic. Therefore, it's something that is a global issue and one that we need to defend, if only because we need to defend free thinkers in countries where they face death for saying many of the things we say today. The final thing I want to say is that I am sick and tired of people telling me how to speak. It's fine, you're allowed to criticize, but don't offend. Don't be provocative. Well, I'm sorry, until the day I'm told that because I am an apostate, I should die, until I'm told that what I'm doing is blasphemous and deserves the death penalty, well, I'm going to speak, and I'm going to speak as loudly as I possibly can. Stop threatening me, stop telling me not to speak, and then I don't need to be as provocative or offensive. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been fighting for freedom of speech for racist people for about 22, 23 years since the first year I went to university, because they tend to be the people who suffer the most censorship on campus and in society. And the mistake some people make, following on from what Maryam said, if you defend freedom of speech for certain people, then that means you must agree with them or think their ideas are acceptable. But the precise opposite is the case. It's precisely because I think their ideas are unacceptable and ugly and hideous that I want them to have freedom of speech. Because I want to know who they are, hear what they think, and stand up to them. There are two problems with hate speech restrictions. The first is that it rebrands what I think to be normal or acceptable ideas as hate speech. For example, Christian ideas, people who are opposed to gay marriage, people who think men are men and women are women, and so on. It rebrands normal thinking as hate speech, but even worse, it is the worst tool, censorship is the worst tool imaginable for challenging genuinely obnoxious, racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic ideas, because it simply pushes them underground and it deprives us, ordinary people, of the right to challenge them and stand up to them and to argue them down. I love hearing hate speech. I relish it. It makes me feel really good because, firstly, because it reminds me that I live in a society that's so free you can be a disgusting person and say disgusting things. That's a nice thing to be reminded of. And secondly, because then I know who these people are and I know what they think and I can sock it to them. The day we don't hear hate speech is the day we should be worried, because that means we're living in a tyrannical society, and even worse, we have been morally disarmed of the freedom and the right and the responsibility to challenge genuinely horrible people.
Now, before I thank my panel, I'd just like to and thank all of you, I'd just like to let you know what Spiked is up to, because we are serious about free speech and we want to seriously want to change the censorious climate on campus and in wider society, not just report about it. And so these are a few ways in which we are currently doing it. Every year we tour across campuses and host debates on free speech and engage with students and challenge them. Through that, we also recruit a whole host of new student journalists who are at the cutting edge and writing about this daily. We're in the process of setting up speakeasy groups and free speech societies across a big range of UK universities, so it's not the case that all students are the problem. And of course, our free speech university rankings, which has really blown up this year and is a key thing to look at if you want to look more into this thing. This is the year that we are really going to change things, and this conference is far from the end of it. So this is a rallying cry to all students in the audience who are sick and tired of being told that they can't say that. Come and collar me and Tom and get involved. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Conway Hall, to the Spike team, to our speakers and our audience.